In this episode, we will examine the day 17 climbers died on Mount Babkha, and only 2 survived. Wounded pride and defiance drove rejected students to think they could summit Mount Babkha without guides during a season closed for avalanche danger. The outcome that followed was so brutal, it left rescuers digging frozen bodies out of compacted snow for 2 weeks. It was May 3rd, 1985, and the slopes of the Kamar-Daban mountain range in southeastern Siberia were soaking in afternoon sunlight. The temperature hovered around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, the sky stretched blue and cloudless, and snow lay deep across the terrain, roughly 6.5 feet in places, softening steadily under a spring sun that had been working on it for hours. 19 hikers were on that mountain. They were students and young workers affiliated with the tourism section of the Irkutsk Pedagogical Institute, and they had been in the mountains for several days. Most were newcomers, enthusiastic but inexperienced in their early 20s, with limited backcountry training. Among them were 3 more experienced members who had helped the group prepare. Alexei Potapeko was one of the seasoned hikers. He had previous mountain experience and had spent weeks before the trip helping train the newcomers in basic skills: route planning, equipment handling, movement in snow. Mikhail Mikhailov had also assisted with preparations, and Alexander Yepin rounded out the trio of experienced members. All 3 had taken rotating turns leading the group through steeper terrain during the preceding days, setting fixed ropes at technical sections and breaking trail through deep snow. Their presence gave the group a degree of competence it would not otherwise have possessed. But competence and formal leadership were different things, and the gap between them would prove decisive. The Kamar-Daban range ran approximately 220 miles long and 30 to 40 miles wide through the Republic of Buryatia, its lower slopes covered in dense coniferous forest inhabited by bears, deer, elk, and wolves. Higher up, the trees gave way to alpine meadows scattered with wildflowers and pristine mountain lakes. The range received roughly 51 inches of precipitation annually, the wettest area in the entire Baikal region, a statistic that translated directly into deep, persistent snowpack well into the spring months. Among its peaks stood Babkha, a 2-summited mountain rising to approximately 6,860 feet. By Himalayan standards, it was modest. By local standards, it was one of the most popular ascents in the region, considered accessible to beginners since the first recorded climb in the 1970s. In winter, hikers climbed it on skis. In spring, it attracted university groups and sports clubs from across the Irkutsk region. It was the kind of mountain that lulled people into confidence, not tall enough to demand fear, not remote enough to feel dangerous, and not technical enough to require specialized training. The group had not been authorized to be on this mountain. They had originally prepared for the annual May Turiad, a long-standing Soviet tradition of mass-organized ascents held each spring, drawing hundreds of participants from hiking clubs, universities, and sports sections across the Irkutsk region. That year, the event was staged in the eastern Sayan Mountains, and the turnout was unprecedented. Buses loaded with hikers, instructors, and certified group leaders converged on the staging towns. But when organizers began processing the flood of registrations, they realized capacity had been exceeded. There were not enough buses, not enough instructors, and not enough qualified leaders to safely manage everyone. A selection was made, the most prepared participants were approved, and the rest were told to go home. The Irkutsk Pedagogical Institute group was among those rejected. The news landed hard. They had spent weeks preparing. They had arranged time off from work and studies. They had packed rucksacks, purchased supplies, and trained specifically for the event. Going home felt like an insult, a judgment about their capability that none of them were willing to accept. So, they decided to go anyway, not to the official Turiad in the eastern Sayans, but on their own unsanctioned hike into the Kamar-Daban range. They could not secure seats on the buses carrying approved participants, so they took the electric train to the town of Slyudanka on the southwestern shore of Lake Baikal, transferred to a local train to the village of Uktulik, and continued on foot into the mountains. They went without certified instructors, without formal group leaders, without registering their route or names with any authority. In the terminology of Soviet mountain bureaucracy, they were considered savages, unregistered, unmonitored, and invisible to the safety infrastructure that existed to prevent exactly the kind of disaster they were walking toward, and they went in direct violation of a seasonal closure. The Central Tourism Board had prohibited visits to the Kamar Daban Ridge until May 25th due to avalanche danger during the late spring thaw, the period when warming temperatures destabilized the deep snowpack that had accumulated over winter. The group arrived on the mountain 3 weeks before that restriction was scheduled to lift. The approach went smoothly. They hiked through river valleys flanked by dense taiga, gaining elevation gradually through snow that softened and deepened as they climbed. The air smelled of pine resin and wet earth, where patches of ground had begun to emerge along sun-facing banks. They established a base camp near a pristine alpine lake at the foot of Babkha Peak, a sheltered spot surrounded by meadows that would bloom with wild garlic and mountain flowers once the snow finally retreated. Roughly 22 people occupied the camp. The mood was high. Whatever sting remained from the Turiad rejection had been replaced by the satisfaction of having made their own way into the mountains on their own terms. They were not alone in the area. A group of hikers from the city of Angarsk, led by an experienced outdoorsman named Victor Sher, had established camp nearby in the cirque of a neighboring peak called Porozhesti. Sher had arrived by the same route, trained to Sludanka, then Utulik, then on foot up the Babka River Valley. He was methodical about snow safety. He carried modified ski poles wrapped with tape at 4-inch intervals to measure snowpack depth, a practice he had adopted at the request of a friend working in avalanche research for the Irkutsk Hydrographic Service. His measurements that week showed snow depths of approximately 6.5 feet, deep even for late spring. But the snow appeared stable. It was compacted, it bore weight without collapsing, and nowhere on the surrounding slopes could Sher identify even minor slide activity. He led his own group up Porozhesti with standard precautions, keeping to ridgelines, avoiding slope cuts, maintaining spacing, while noting privately that the snowpack seemed deceptively benign. From his camp, Sher could hear the Irkutsk students. Their voices drifted down through the trees from somewhere above, young, animated, bright with the energy of people enjoying themselves in the mountains. Laughter and singing carried across the snow and the still air. Someone in Sher's group knew who they were. Students from the Pedagogical Institute who had been turned away from the Turiad and were training independently on Kamar Daban. Where exactly they had set up camp was unclear, but they sounded close, and they sounded happy. The sound of that laughter on the mountain slopes would stay with Victor Sher for the rest of his life. May 3rd was the group's last day before they were scheduled to break camp and return home. 19 of the roughly 22 members decided to mark the occasion with a summit attempt on Babkha. 3 stayed behind at the base camp. The 19 departed at approximately 10 a.m. under conditions that could not have appeared more favorable. Clear skies, comfortable temperatures, light wind, excellent visibility. The snow was deep, and the hikers broke through the crust regularly on the ascent. But the climbing was straightforward and the atmosphere was celebratory. This was their final day. This was the summit that would cap the trip. Yepin, Mikhailov, and Podopoyko set up fixed rope sections at the steeper parts of the route. Horizontal and vertical traverses rigged to help the less experienced members navigate safely. The group ascended in a column, taking turns breaking trail through knee-deep snow. Mikhailov and another climber reached the summit first at approximately 1:05 p.m. The last of the 19 arrived by 1:40 p.m. All 19 stood on top of Babkha Peak, with Lake Baikal shimmering to the north and the ridgelines of the Kamar Daban range extending to the horizon. They ate chocolate, sausage, and candy. They sang songs. Cameras were passed around as everyone took photographs. They found the traditional summit jar, a container left by previous hikers holding a route note, and collected it. Mikhailov wrote a replacement, but nobody had brought a pencil or paper, so he used the charred tip of a match to scratch words onto a chocolate wrapper. The message read, 19 parachutists have successfully landed on Babkha Peak. Temperature plus 12 degrees, picked up the hiker's note, flying further. He added notes about the wind and sun, and mentioned that they had been sinking through the snow near the summit. They carried no thermoses, no flasks, no water of any kind. They drank nothing during the entire time they spent on top. They lingered for approximately 3 hours, far longer than safety-conscious mountaineers would recommend at that elevation during late spring, and long enough that the afternoon sun had been working on the snowpack for hours, warming the surface layers and weakening the bond between the fresh spring snow and the older, harder substrate beneath it. Around 3 p.m., the group began their descent, and here, the sequence of decisions tightened toward catastrophe. Rather than retracing the route they had climbed, a path already broken through the snow and known to be stable, they chose a different line down the mountain. The reason, according to accounts gathered afterward, was that they intended to leave a note at a nearby pass along the alternate route. It was a casual decision, an afterthought, the kind of small detour that feels harmless when the sun is shining and the summit glow has not yet faded. Mikhailov led. When he tired, Yepin took over, and then Podopeko rotated to the front. The 3 experienced members traded the lead position, while the remaining 16 followed in a column behind them. The snow on this unfamiliar slope was deep and saturated. The hikers sank to their knees with every step, the soft spring snow offering no resistance. The lead group maintained some spacing between themselves, but behind them, the column compressed. 16 people walking close together on an untested slope, their combined weight pressing into snow that had been absorbing solar energy all afternoon. No avalanche instructor was present to enforce safe distances between climbers. No one assessed the slope angle or probed the snowpack stability before committing the group to the new route. The group carried avalanche cords, brightly colored ropes designed to be thrown out during a slide to help rescuers locate the person attached, but every cord remained coiled in a pocket. Galina Mishurina, one of the newer members, would later confirm that no safety briefing was given before the ascent or the descent. No marching order was assigned. No contingency was discussed. The group was descending not along the crest of the slope, the safest line where weight is distributed along the ridge rather than loading the face below, but just beneath it. Their footsteps were undermining the snowpack from above, each boot punching through the surface crust and transferring force into the layers below. It was the precise mechanism that avalanche safety training is designed to prevent. But there was no one present with that training. Podopeko was at the front, well ahead of the main body. Mishurina was near the back, with roughly 5 people behind her. Yepin was somewhere in the middle of the column when he felt the slope shift beneath his boots, a movement that had nothing to do with footsteps. He shouted the avalanche warning, but the snow was already fracturing before the sound reached the people ahead of him. The slab broke in a single clean line across the slope. The rushing mass of wet spring snow knocked the hikers off their feet, swept them downhill, flung them over a cliff band, and buried them under meters of debris that compressed on impact into something closer to concrete than powder. The thunder of the slide rolled across the valley and then stopped. The entire event lasted seconds. What replaced it was a silence so complete that the only sound was the wind moving across the debris. Podopeko had been far enough ahead to shelter behind a rock outcrop as the avalanche swept past. When the snow dust cleared, he stood and looked back at a landscape that no longer resembled what had existed moments before. The slope where 19 people had been walking was now a vast debris field of churned snow and shattered ice. No voices, no movement. He descended into the avalanche cone and began searching. He found Mishurina quickly. Her legs were visible above the surface, her body inverted, head buried in the snow. He dug her out and revived her. Together, they searched the debris field for any trace of the other 17. The avalanche deposit covered an enormous area, and over it hung a silence that answered their calls before the echoes faded. No cries for help, no limbs protruding from the surface, no avalanche cords trailing across the snow. Everyone still coiled in a pocket beneath meters of compacted debris. Mishurina and Podopeko descended to the base camp and reported what had happened. The 3 members who had stayed behind that morning listened to the account in a silence that would define the hours and days that followed. There was nothing they could do. No shovels adequate for the scale of the debris. No communication equipment to call for help. The nearest town was a full day's hike through deep snow. All they could do was send word down the mountain and wait for people with the resources to respond. News of the disaster reached the Turiad participants over the following days. The official event in the Eastern Sayans had ended on May 5th, and participants were returning to the town of Sliudanka in high spirits, sunburned, tired, and looking forward to hot meals and train rides home. Mikhail Sapijev, a returning hiker, was buying train tickets and standing in a cafeteria line when the command rang out for the Turiad to assemble at the buses. The mood shifted instantly. The announcement was delivered without softening. A group group of hikers had been caught in an avalanche near Babkha Peak. 17 of 19 were under the snow. All men were deploying for rescue operations immediately. Remaining food was to be pooled, equipment redistributed, women handed over their down jackets, spare socks, and mittens. School children were sent home by train. Everyone else was going back into the mountains. Approximately 150 of the most experienced hikers and mountaineers in the region were assembled and transported to the avalanche site. Boris Zverev initially commanded the rescue before handing leadership to Liudis Jabrauskas, a veteran rescuer who had spent years in the mountains and would spend the rest of his life carrying the weight of what the next 2 weeks demanded from him and his teams. Helicopters brought the rescue parties to the site. The aircraft hovered over small clearings near the debris field, while rescuers jumped from the machines directly into deep snow with packs on their backs, the rotor wash throwing up clouds of powder that stung exposed skin. From the landing zone, they descended steep slopes to reach the avalanche cone below. The routine was immediate. Rucksacks dropped, a mouthful of tea, shovels and avalanche probes in hand, and straight to the debris field where work was already underway. The search was systematic and brutal. Rescuers drove thin metal probes into the avalanche debris in organized patterns, feeling for the resistance that signaled a body beneath the surface. The first 8 were found quickly through surface probing, their positions shallow enough that the rods reached them within 10 to 16 feet. But below that depth, the compressed spring snow had set rigid. Probes would not penetrate further. To continue searching, the rescuers had to dig vertical shafts by hand. Exploratory trenches sunk into the debris, with diggers standing in narrow pits surrounded by walls of hardened snow while watching the slopes above that had not yet released. Jabrauskas would later describe the atmosphere in terms that made the psychological toll visible. Every rescuer who drove a probe into the snow carried a private hope that the next strike would find someone alive, that someone had found an air pocket, had survived the compression, was still breathing beneath the surface. The men worked until their hands bled, blisters splitting open from the relentless shoveling, sustained by a hope that thinned with every body they recovered. With each discovery, the calculation shifted further from rescue toward recovery, but no one stopped working. The danger to the rescuers themselves was constant. Standing in grave-like trenches surrounded by loaded slopes that could release at any moment required a specific kind of discipline, the ability to focus on the task at hand while remaining alert to the terrain above. At one point, Jabrauskas ordered a watchman to shout a false avalanche warning to test the team's readiness. The result was the most synchronized sprint he had ever witnessed. Every person on the debris field dropped their tools and ran. When they realized it was a drill, Jabrauskas received feedback that was colorful even by Russian backcountry standards. But the point was made. Complacency on the debris field could add rescuers to the body count. Then a Mi-8 transport helicopter appeared directly above the site without warning. Officials had decided they wanted an aerial view of the operation. The problem was immediate and serious. The turbine engines of the Mi-8 produced low-frequency vibrations that penetrated deep into snowpack, exactly the kind of energy that could destabilize already loaded slopes and trigger the secondary avalanche the rescuers had been working to avoid. Jabrauskas cursed over the open radio frequency for the first time in his career, by his own account. The helicopter departed immediately and did not return. Several smaller avalanches did release on surrounding slopes during the operation, and while none struck the debris field directly, each one reminded the rescuers of the margin they were operating within. The condition of the first bodies recovered told the rescuers what they had feared but had not yet accepted. The victims showed signs of catastrophic chest compression. The mass of wet spring snow had crushed their rib cages before they could draw a breath, raise an arm, or assume any protective posture. None had created an air pocket near their mouth, the fundamental survival response taught in avalanche safety training. None had deployed their avalanche cords. The bodies were frozen in positions that captured the instant of impact, arms extended mid-stride, legs folded at impossible angles, faces fixed in expressions that belonged to the fraction of a second between walking and oblivion. If this was the condition of the shallow burials, the chances of anyone surviving deeper in the debris were effectively zero. The rescuers kept digging anyway. Before the recovered bodies could be transported down the mountain, they had to thaw. The rescuers laid them in direct sunlight along the slopes and waited. What followed was a sight that no one present ever fully processed. As warmth returned to the frozen tissue, the bodies began to move under their own shifting weight. Arms that had been locked overhead slowly lowered. Torsos that had been rigid bent forward and sat upright. Most of the dead were young women, and their faces carried a pink coloring that made them appear to be sleeping. Wind moved through their hair, loose braids and ribbons stirring gently, adding a detail to the scene that no amount of professional experience could absorb without cost. One rescuer watched a body slowly sit upright bright in the sunlight. His reaction was severe enough that the team had to evacuate him down the mountain, making him, as Jabrauskas later noted with grim practicality, the first person they actually had to rescue from the operation. The remaining rescuers dealt with the psychological weight the way generations before them had: vodka, consumed without toasts, around a fire where men told stories until the images loosened their grip enough to allow sleep. The search continued for approximately 2 weeks. All 17 bodies were eventually recovered from the debris and brought down from the mountain. None had survived the initial impact. The avalanche had killed every one of them in the same fraction of a second, and 2 weeks of desperate work had only confirmed what the silence on May 3rd had already made clear. On June 13th, 1985, the newspaper Soviet Youth published an investigation identifying a chain of preventable failures. No qualified avalanche instructors were present. The group descended below the ridge crest rather than along it, loading the slope with their weight. They maintained dangerously close spacing. They climbed 3 weeks before the Central Tourism Board's seasonal closure was set to expire, and they went unregistered, invisible to every system designed to prevent exactly this. A small monument now stands on Babkha Peak. It is easy to miss, but 17 names are attached to it, and the story behind them remains a reminder that even mountains considered easy can kill without hesitation. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.